Greetings. I send my warmest congratulations to the Climate Heritage Network on this auspicious occasion of your global launch in the great city of Edinburgh. I wish I could be with you in person, but am pleased to share a few thoughts via video message. Most importantly, I wish to express my ardent support for your efforts to defend cultural heritage from one of the greatest threats that it has ever faced, climate change. Today, in the face of the climate emergency, we all must face up to our critical responsibilities for nothing less than the preservation of human life as we know it, including human cultures. As former High Commissioner for Human Rights Navi Pillai said, climate change is one of the most serious challenges humanity has ever faced. All relevant actors at the international and national levels must act with determination to respond to this threat. My primary messages today are, number one, that the impact of climate change is an urgent human rights question, including a question for cultural rights, those cultural rights that are at the heart of my UN mandate as Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. And climate change must be understood and responded to as such, that is to say, as a human rights, cultural rights issue. Number two, culture in all its forms, cultural rights and human rights, represent powerful resources to prevent and address the challenges caused by climate change in a human rights respecting manner. I entirely support the call of my colleague, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, for international recognition, similar to that in regional instruments, of the human right to a healthy environment. He further explained that a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is integral to the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights. As I explained in my 2018 report to the General Assembly, the universality of human rights, including cultural rights, has no meaning today without a livable environment in which they can be enjoyed. Climate change specifically is also a human rights issue, as Professor Knox, the former Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, so clearly explained in a crucial 2016 report for the Human Rights Council, and it is one with a particular set of impacts on women, children, persons with disabilities, and indigenous peoples. Climate change often has the most dramatic effect on the human rights of those who have done the least to contribute to the problem in the first place. Today, then, we focus on the intersection between two critical human rights questions, climate change and cultural rights, and specifically, cultural heritage. The cultural heritage impacts of climate change may be less well known, but they are critically important. All of humanity has a link to such precious objects, sites, and practices which represent the cultural heritage of all humankind. Climate change is today amongst the greatest threats to cultural heritage, as you know, both tangible and intangible, as well as natural heritage. As noted in an excellent 2014 monograph entitled Climate Change as a Threat to Peace, Impacts on Cultural Heritage and Cultural Diversity, there are a myriad of ongoing and potential effects. For example, cultural heritage sites face threats from temperature changes, soil erosion, flooding, and storms. Natural heritage sites face developments such as glaciers melting and habitats changing. In addition, as the monograph I cited warns, climate change is likely to affect cultural diversity and sociocultural interactions by forcing communities to change their work habits and ways of life to compete for resources or to migrate elsewhere. I am greatly alarmed that as long ago as 2014, an academic study found that more than 130 World Heritage cultural sites around the world were then already at long-term risk from sea level rise, from the archaeological site of Carthage in Tunisia to India's Elephanta caves. Moreover, we know that climate change is a threat multiplier, which means it magnifies existing threats to cultural heritage, such as fueling resource conflicts in which heritage destruction may tragically take place. How does this affect human rights? The right of access to and enjoyment of cultural heritage forms part of international human rights law, finding its legal basis in the right to take part in cultural life, guaranteed both by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and by the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, a binding treaty which has 170 state parties spanning every region of the world, including the United Kingdom. Cultural heritage is then a human rights issue in and of itself, but it is also a fundamental resource for the enjoyment of other human rights, like the rights to freedom of expression, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, access to history and a diversity of scientific knowledge as part of the right to education, as well as the economic rights of the many people who earn a living through tourism related to such heritage, and indeed the right to development. All of these human rights may be impacted by climate change as it erodes cultural heritage. There is a clear connection between the destruction of heritage and the destruction of lives, livelihoods, and land. Climate change is having and will continue to have a grave impact on the cultural heritage of all humankind, and hence on the related human rights of millions of human beings. This reality has not been adequately acknowledged in current climate change initiatives and is part of why what you are doing together in Edinburgh and beyond is so important. A human rights approach to cultural heritage and to climate change can amplify our campaigning on these issues. It has the potential to provide an effective additional normative basis for the protection of cultural heritage from the adverse consequences of climate change, including in the form of the international community's obligation under Article 15 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which requires both national-level action and international cooperation to guarantee the right to take part in cultural life, which includes the right to enjoy and have access to cultural heritage. In addition, a human rights approach requires paying attention to the disparate impacts of climate change, which magnifies and is magnified by underlying inequalities. For example, it implies taking a gender-sensitive approach to the protection of cultural heritage, including by recognizing the work of women cultural heritage defenders and promoting the inclusion of women cultural heritage experts in all the relevant discussions. Another vital aspect of the human rights approach is the emphasis on participation and consultation of affected people, especially those most affected with regard to policies and responses. As the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights explained in 2009, the application of a human rights approach in preventing and responding to the effects of climate change serves to empower individuals and groups who should be perceived as active agents of change, not as passive victims. Nations who face forced displacement, hunger, and security threats due to climate change note that in addition to this, the cultural identity of their entire nations may be under threat. Movement away from homelands results in removal from one's tangible cultural heritage, but also threatens the possibilities of maintaining cultural practices that may be linked to certain sites or natural resources, such as the land. The conservation and transmission of intangible heritage must also then be considered. As I firmly believe, inspired by the motto of the Afghan National Museum, a nation stays alive when its culture stays alive. The damage and destruction of cultural heritage when those most closely connected to it are already suffering from other severe impacts of climate change also takes away a key cultural resource that can build resilience and help these people to cope at the very moment when they need such resources the most. In other words, cultural heritage is not only a potential casualty, it is also a part of the response to climate change, part of the solution. For example, traditional knowledge, including that of indigenous peoples, peasants, and fishermen and women, such as traditional fire management and agricultural techniques, should be considered in developing adaptation responses. We have to think more broadly about the relationship between culture and addressing climate change. The latter requires marshaling cultural resources and necessitates cultural change, including in our ways of interacting with nature. We also need to build institutional bridges between policymakers in the fields of culture and the environment, as my UN country missions have made clear. I traveled to the Maldives, a small island developing state, for the UN in June. For some, Maldives is a tourist paradise. But for the local population, they are facing the potentially existential threat of climate change. And I often ask myself, how often should I use the word existential? However, in the case of the Maldives, this is no hyperbola. As the Minister of the Environment stressed to me, a 2-degree temperature rise or more will result in 60 to 90% of the coral reefs being destroyed, a key part of the natural heritage, but also a key protector of the Maldives. As the minister said to me, without those reefs to protect islands, they will be washed away. He further stressed that the culture and language of the Maldives are also specifically threatened by the possibility of environmental catastrophe. Personally, I will never forget the sight of a centuries-old cemetery containing mausolea of historical significance, reportedly of those who first brought Islam to the Maldives, a cemetery that is in close proximity to the ocean, perhaps less than 100 meters away, and that locals fear will simply be gone in 10 years' time due to sea level rise and to erosion. So our very history is at stake. A 15-year-old Maldivian environmental and cultural heritage activist on Midu Island, speaking about the potential loss of local cultural sites and the erosion of his home island, said to me, "I fear for the survival of my country." He meant also for the cultural survival of his country. No young person should have to face such fears. That is why your efforts are so important. I traveled to Tuvalu, a remote Pacific island nation, in September, and when I ended my fact-finding visit, I again issued a call for the world to do more to head off climate change. I was in the capital, Funafuti, the same week as the UN Climate Action Summit in New York, and from Funafuti urged the international community and governments around the world to urgently take the necessary steps to respond to the climate emergency and the existential threats posed to island nations like Tuvalu and their cultures. I noted that the very cultural survival of peoples may be at stake as never before, undermining all human rights, including cultural rights. And this again underlines why the efforts of your network are critical. As one Tuvaluan official asked me, if we are not here anymore, what will become of our culture? These are the kinds of questions people around the world may have to ask themselves. I was taken to a location in Funafuti where waves are for the first time reported to be rising onto the narrow land at high tide. And I will never forget the words of a woman who told me, "Tuvalu is drowning. Its shorelines are receding. The world needs to help Tuvalu." One of the great honors that I had during my time was to visit the National Library of Tuvalu. It is indeed the only library in the country, and it too is very close to the ocean. And the librarian, the head librarian, is trying to figure out how he can save his collection, hoping perhaps to move it elsewhere, hoping to digitize as many precious historical resources as possible. And in fact, climate researchers come from around the world to use that library to research things like the history of meteorological patterns and fishing patterns. And so our efforts to actually understand the threat of climate change and how best to meet it are at risk because of the potential loss of this collection. That librarian and his team need international support. They need resources to be able to build a facility that can protect all of those precious aspects of heritage and history in their care. As I was leaving Tuvalu, I committed to take home with me the message I saw on billboards there, that helping Tuvalu face this challenge is helping the world to do so. And I think it is that attitude of international cooperation and solidarity that needs to permeate our work in this area of defending cultural heritage from climate change. And that, again, is why I think your work as a network is so very important and why I am determined to support it. There is no time to waste, as we all know. This brings me to my conclusion and thinking about the ways forward. In 2020, climate change and culture around the world will be a priority area of work for the cultural rights mandate that I hold. And I will present a thematic report on this topic to the General Assembly, conveying these messages in October of 2020. I hope I can rely on your expert input in doing this work, and also on your efforts to help secure the support of governments for the implementation of my recommendations to the General Assembly. We must all find ways to come together in view of the unprecedented threat of climate change, to take the action needed to protect human civilization, its cultures, its traces and histories, its evolving contemporary manifestations, its heritage, in all its glorious diversities and pluralities, and in accordance with international standards, and most of all, the indispensable ways in which this heritage enables human beings to enjoy their internationally guaranteed human rights. Let us all commit to work together toward these goals going forward with a sense of urgency, but also with a sense of hope, and I think your network is really built on hope. Our work together to achieve this vision has only just begun. Let me conclude with a few specific recommendations. The first is that we work to mainstream the human rights approach to climate change and cultural heritage, and we make sure that the human rights approach to climate change has culture and cultural rights as core elements. The next recommendation is that we take a holistic approach. That means we encompass all regions. We bring together young people and less young people. We work on different kinds of cultural heritage so that we are concerned about the protection of tangible and intangible cultural heritage. We are concerned about the protection of natural heritage. We recognize the interlinkages. We take a holistic approach emphasizing both education and accountability, and considering the impact of actions by both states and non-state actors. Frankly, we will not make much progress until there is more accountability. We must support the recommendation made in the report World Heritage and Tourism in a Changing Climate, prepared by UNESCO, the UN Environmental Programme, and the Union of Concerned Scientists, the recommendation to include cultural heritage in climate vulnerability assessments and policy responses at all levels. We must support and publicize the Pocantico call to action on climate impacts and cultural heritage, for which I express my support, and in particular endorse its call for ensuring that cultural heritage voices are represented in climate policy discussions at all levels. If, as the UN Secretary General has warned, governments do not take effective action by 2020, which is just around the corner, to deal with climate change, we may indeed, as he suggested, be facing a runaway train, which may be increasingly difficult to stop. The human rights impacts and the impacts on cultural heritage in countries like the Maldives and Tuvalu, but literally in every country in the world, will be nothing short of devastating. So the time for action is now, which again makes your convening so important. But it is not, as I stress to my students, a time for despair. It is a time for hope based on a commitment to realizing a concrete and effective global response, which is precisely what your network aims to do. On that note, I want to end with the words of the late, great Berta Cáceres, an indigenous environmental and cultural rights defender from Honduras who was assassinated for her work in 2016, but who bequeathed to all of us her brave spirit that we might continue her efforts. She said, "Let us come together and move forward with hope as we defend and care for the earth and its spirits." Thank you for carrying on her work. I wish the Climate Heritage Network every success in its vital efforts, and I look forward to our ongoing collaboration. May you have a very successful meeting and a very successful launch. Thank you.